Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 6 from Biosphere, Autour de la Lune. Okay, so an album like this one is really difficult to quantify. See, first and foremost, I think it's always better for an artist to push themselves into new territory and reinvent themselves than stick to the same old tried and true formulas all the time. Always good to keep things fresh. And this album is quite unlike any of Jansen's previous work. While still very much a headphone-centric ambient release, this album falls into much more straightforward drone territory. Like, if you thought Shenzhou's looped samples of Debussy to be hyper-minimalistic, it's nothing compared to how minimal this album is. Autour is one of the most minimalistic albums I've ever heard. Not only does it somehow have more simplistic arrangements than those of Shenzhou, a lot of these tracks have everything going on in the bass frequencies. This is the kind of album that you absolutely need a good pair of headphones to get the most out of, or much of anything out of. It's also not the kind of album that you can just listen to once and expect to get. I should know, because I distinctly remember hearing this thing for the first time and thinking, wow, that really sucked. That was barely even an album at all. It sounded like one consistent pad that's barely changed at all, aside from allowing time for complete silence. What the hell is this? Have we really gone off the deep end that ambient music can go? There's like nothing to grab onto at all. Now, I no longer think this album is terrible, obviously. I feel like I at least get it now. Like, maybe, I guess my headphones weren't good enough when I first heard this thing. Like, listening to the first track, Translation, now, it feels like in a lot of ways it picks up from where Shenzhou left off. A lot of repetitive chords that just cut in at random, but other textures that very slowly come and go, some bassy pads, a repetitive sample of what sounds like some distant, dissonant trumpet, some buzzing but low-key synth leads, and some that resemble xylophones in other parts. But when I first heard this, I thought I was listening to a single sustained chord playing completely unchanged for 20 straight minutes. No, there's actual progression to this piece, and it has a menacing vibe that works quite well. Minimalistic, sure, but not outright boring. So okay, this album may be a lot better than what I thought about it initially. It does have a decent amount of variety, it does have a vibe that you can't get elsewhere. Like, it's an album that reminds me of Space, as you might guess from the title. But not in the same sense that his early work like Microgravity and Potashnik does. This album is spacey in the sense that space itself is a cold, black, empty vacuum with no air that you do not want to be in. This album is very spooky and unnerving, creating many simplistic drone pieces that aim to really get under your skin. And it is quite effective in that way. I definitely have to give it props for that, even in its weaker moments. But if it wasn't obvious from my word choice up to this point, it's still not one of my favorite Biosphere albums. I can appreciate it for its risk-taking and its unique concept and even its spot-on execution, but I don't think it's so compelling to the point of being just as interesting as any other Biosphere album. It's still a lot of empty space. This album also kinda slowly loses me about halfway through. Like, it has two more big highlights for me outside of the 20-minute monster of the opener, which I already talked about. Like, the dissonant bells and super bassy pads of Rotation are pretty neat, and the pulsating radio static of Modifié, with its spooky, filtered snippets of barely audible music, are an interesting addition as well. They're nice. But then it goes into Vibratoire, or however you say that, which is just nothing but 3 minutes of pure bass rumbling. Spooky, sure, but it's like a basic horror movie sound design thing. Like, bass rumbling and infrasonic stuff like this is unnerving by default, since that's like the natural human reaction to it, and it doesn't have anything else to it besides that bass rumbling. I'd hope for a little more out of a track than just that. And most of the rest of this album is also really reliant on bass rumbling. Deviation is another example, really extremely bass heavy, with just a simple silvery ambient pad on top, and even some high-pitched tinnitus ringing sounds as well, just barely poking out of the mix. It's extremely discomforting to listen to, and the kind of thing that has you questioning what's real and what's just in your head. But of course that's entirely by design. It's at least interesting in the black depths that it explores. And Circulaire really intensifies its bass rumbling and seems to be oddly faster paced, even though it isn't at all. It's just more wavering, I guess. And it has more tinnitus ringing that sometimes abruptly cuts off and you hear that little pop of audio when you abruptly cut off a sound. Another one that likely would be infuriatingly empty and unengaging if you don't have good headphones to allow those bass frequencies to come through. And even this is not exactly the most fun stuff to listen to, but it at least makes sense in context. There's like a brief interlude here, Disparu, that brings in some very subtle, airy melodic pads. There's that little tiny hint of musicality, well, barely there at all, is at least a welcome addition, I guess. And then there's Inverse, which is also mainly bass rumbling, but it switches between two different distinct pitches, which do have a somewhat menacing interval, like a diminished fourth or something like that. Whatever the distance between C and A flat is, it's that. Those aren't the two actual notes, I don't think, but it's that interval. Yeah, there's a couple more tinnitus ringing pads, and then it finally transitions seamlessly into Tombant, which is literally just an 8-minute reprise of the opener, and that's it. Kind of disappointing ending, but I guess it makes sense. I mean, this album is not made out of nothing or is completely devoid of anything interesting to talk about. It does feel like the musical equivalent of The Complete Vacuum of Space, as I mentioned, just barely containing enough elements to even feel like it qualifies as music at all. But it's not the kind of thing that I really see myself being in the mood for all the time. I see its purpose, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't get an emotional reaction out of me. It's a hell of a spooky album. But I personally would rather return to other Biosphere albums that have more musicality to them and aren't deliberately trying to get under my skin with really simplistic frequency modulations. It has its moments for sure and accomplishes everything that it was trying to accomplish, but I don't think it's really my thing as much as some of his other stuff. A neat experiment, but one that feels much more like a one-off curiosity than a must-listen. I think I'm overall feeling like a 6.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.